All right, I'm guessing we're starting, so let's push this button here and move on to, I'm going to try something new here for this module 4. I'm looking at my PowerPoint, but I'm not going to stick it up on the screen because I don't want to be a little bitty box at the bottom, a distraction. And besides that, you have access to the PowerPoint. You can either print it up, take notes on it as I've suggested, or just have it there on the side and look at it on your computer screen. Whatever works best for you. And remember, that's part of the theme of the class is we're all different, and that's one of the reasons that I've suggested that we need a transformation to the system that we have now. So here in this last module before our test next week, we want to just look at a little bit of history to see where we've been and how we got here. And a key point in this assessment of why we are where we are is that, as Rick Hess has noted, this system evolved for reasons of the moment, starting back in the 1830s and probably before that, to get to the point where we started to mandate government-run schooling. It was based on hopes, dreams, wishes, and assumptions and lack of experience that existed at the time, and it was not delivered on some pedestal or on a tablet from the heavens. It was not divinely inspired, as Rick Hess would have put it. It was created by fragile human beings and flawed human beings to meet a need that they saw at the time. So, one point to make here off the first slide is it wasn't deep-seated dissatisfaction with the schooling that was produced by the mostly private, lightly subsidized private system that existed at the time. The reasons, largely shameful, for the political movement at the time to have government start to run schooling, to have it be public schooling, so to speak. A key driver, as it says on your slide number 2, was that they at the time, were seeing a mass influx of Catholics into a nation that at the time was mostly Protestant. And schools were lightly subsidized at the time. So the thought was that there was no basis to exclude the Catholic schools from these subsidies unless all private schooling was excluded from the subsidies. And so that was the decision taken by some key political actors at the time. And so they thought that the only way to exclude Catholic schools from the subsidies that exist at the time was to have a publicly run system and to eliminate subsidies for the private system. So a key selling point that arose at the time, driven in part by this desire to exclude Catholic schools from the subsidies that exist at the time, but also to bind together a nation of diverse immigrants, was this notion that we should force everybody to go to a neighborhood public school. And by schooling them in the same content, we would create a common school experience. Notice how this denies, maybe because they didn't understand it or didn't know it, although it's hard for me to believe that they didn't know that their children were different, that learned differently, but perhaps because schooling was less formal at the time and more smaller classes and spread out more in these one-room schoolhouses. Maybe they didn't understand that one size didn't fit all. So they went directly opposite of that and said we needed to make one size fit all. It's important for our country to make one size fit all, to give all of these diverse immigrants a common schooling experience, to bind them together. All right, so here we have on slide 3 your readings, so I'll skip that one. Now, what we want to talk about is specifically what happened and what was changed by the events of the 1830s and from then on. Publicly produced schooling gained a public finance monopoly. That's really the bottom line, is we decided to subsidize publicly produced schooling, and so that's what we mean by public finance monopoly. That means if you can have a private school still, but you need to charge tuition from that, and the public schools are free. And it's very, very difficult, as you can probably imagine, selling something if someone else is giving it away. So that's what we had. Now, Of course, they're not perfect substitutes, and that's why we still have private schooling to this day, about 10% national average, because some people are willing to pay their taxes and on top of that pay tuition to get their children into specialized settings, in particular religious settings, that, by the way, were not excluded from this initial surge of public schooling. It was only about 100 years later, as it says a few slides later on. It's only about 100 years later that the Supreme Court decided that there needed to be a separation of schooling and state. That was not part of the original intent here, and I'm sure it would not have gotten off the ground in a heavily religious country. The public schooling movement would not have gotten off the ground in this heavily religious country of the 1800s. So anyway, in the 1830s is where this started, and one state after another adopted a public school system, a public finance monopoly, which meant that only publicly run schools would get taxpayer dollars. And it became gradually compulsory in one state after another, mostly until age 16. Okay, you can see here on slide 5 now is where it says that it took 100 years for the Supreme Court to decide that that the Constitution's church-state limitation meant separation of schooling, meant to limit schooling content to non-religious, to secular items. Now, once we have political control, public production of schooling, that means that we've made it political what the content of it will be and who gets to be a teacher, among other jobs of educators. And that assumption that publicly produced schooling would yield a sort of a common schooling experience, content that was would bind a nation together, that might have made a lot more sense than it makes now, simply because schools were smaller. The mythological one-room schoolhouse. Kids schooled each other in many ways. There was a lot less to learn. There were a lot fewer distractions in those days. But population growth, increased urbanization, changed the politics from retail, in other words, where you had to convince your neighbor of things, to wholesale, where you have slogans on radio and television. Mass messaging increasingly replaces personal communication, so this changed the nature of the political process. And then the growth in schools, urbanization meant that it became convenient to zone your neighborhood public school part of neighborhoods. So we started to sort by neighborhoods, and we started to sort children by age because it was convenient to do it. We didn't think about how that might be problematic, that it was probably made more sense to separate them by ability, by certain subjects, but also that turned out gradually, as we'll find out in Module 5, to be increasingly politically incorrect to label children as faster or slower, and within the same campus and within the same attendance zone. All right, so what changed was that we had bigger classes, and politics went from retail to wholesale, which fundamentally changes it. A key person to mention here, a key driver of this movement to create public schooling, was Horace Mann, a commissioner of education in the state of Massachusetts. And so he was the big mover and shaker for this, made the arguments that were compelling ultimately in getting one state after another to adopt public schooling, and thus political control of schooling content, and then to deny the subsidies to Catholic schools. And by the way, if you're curious, we're now on slide 8. You have to understand what they did or didn't know at the time. There was little science-based evidence at the time, and there probably isn't even all that much now, to identify specifically the likely policy outcomes of political control of schooling, especially since we really hadn't even settled on exactly what political control of schooling meant. E.G. West, James Tooley, and others like Milton Friedman rigorously questioned, and this is like in the last 30 or 40 years, rigorously questioned the key assumptions, mostly implicit, that public production of schooling entailed, and that it didn't really take public production of schooling, as was assumed, to realize the alleged and sometimes real public benefits of schooling. But again, all of this was not occurring back in the 1800s. It was driven by hope triumphing over experience, hope triumphing over lack of experience. And so the public production proponents at the time, and still to this day, would argue that if we didn't have public production, if we didn't compel folks to be in certain schools with certain curricula chosen politically, that they would neglect courses that were key to citizenship. They would neglect courses not directly related to the earning power, the future earning power of their children. But E.G. West in particular, Tooley, Friedman, and others argued that it wasn't the quantity of schooling per se that might be a function of whether we subsidize it or not, but the nature of the content and exactly what parents would buy on their own versus what they would not buy if it was not subsidized. It was that discussion that led at least to some thinking about, subsidies, okay, sure, that always increases the amount of schooling, but is this additional amount, is that the stuff that is particularly needed for citizenship, neighborhood effect, public benefit sort of schooling effects? What Friedman, Tooley, and others have concluded is it's not the additional schooling that might be foregone if parents had to pay for it privately out of pocket versus if it was subsidized. It was not that. It was the basic schooling. It was not that mattered most to citizenship. It was basic skill acquisition, the ability to read, write, and think that mattered most to these public benefits of schooling, citizenship, etc. And those were the things that everybody would buy if they bought anything at all. And so they coined a very economic term that you may want to look at since you're all economists, inframarginal, INFRA-marginal. That term says that it's not at the margin that the citizenship-related, public benefit-related schooling would occur, that it was short of the margin that would occur no matter whether it was subsidized or not. Another quick drink because I'm a little bit struggling with dry mouth this morning. I was at a conference out west over the weekend, so I guess the dry air got to me a little bit there. All right, so back to we're on slide 10 now. One of the arguments, among many, that Horace Mann and others made at the time was that if we had increased subsidy of schooling, and in particular through publicly produced schools, that we would increase economic development, social cohesion, it would reduce crime, among other things. Things that did seem to happen to some degree at the time, probably because more children would attend school more often and thus learn more than they otherwise learned, perhaps, at least initially, until some of the political effects of the content of schooling took hold. These are sort of evolutionary things. Political control didn't instantly have all of the effects that we see today. And now it seems, 100 and something years later, that publicly funded, publicly controlled, publicly produced schooling seems to be having some of the opposite effects of what it was intended to have had and maybe it initially did have back in the mid-1800s when this movement began. And another reason for publicly funded schooling at times is the assertion that some parents are negligent and that they won't even send their children to school at all if it isn't mandatory and if it isn't provided for free through taxes. West, Tooley, and even Thomas Jefferson made the point that the number of such negligent parents is probably too small to address by changing the nature of schooling for everybody, probably detrimentally, but which should be handled on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so again, I got ahead of myself a little bit in some of these slides. There were key benefits of increased provision of government production of schooling. There was more attendance. More children went for more hours. It probably improved equity to some extent because some children that were highly reliant on philanthropy to get any schooling at all were no longer dependent on that. They had access to a public school slot funded by the taxes paid by others. And a key benefit of schooling to this day that's relatively unrecognized is that when we finance schooling heavily through taxes, we spread the cost of schooling over family's lifetime. Think about this a little bit. Suppose you have kids, say, a year or two apart, and so by your late 20s, you've got 3 kids in school. How would most families manage to pay $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 per child per year of schooling? If you had 3 kids in school at one time, that'd be probably $20,000 to $30,000. Most parents couldn't manage to do that. But yet we have a system that costs $12,000 to $13,000 per child per year. So that money's coming from your taxes somewhere, somehow. How can that be? Well, it can be because you pay taxes before you have kids, and you pay taxes while you have kids, and you pay taxes till you die, long after your kids are adults and paying taxes themselves. And so what you've done by using taxes to pay for schooling is you spread out that cost that the system incurs of $12,000 to $13,000 per child per year, which occurs during a relatively short part of an adult's family's lifetime. You've spread that cost over that household's, those 2 adults' entire lifetime. Now, additional issues to take account of. We had to raise taxes, of course, to pay for publicly funded schooling. And whenever you raise taxes, there's increased avoidance, which is legal. In other words, not doing what it is that's being taxed. For example, higher school taxes make it more costly. Raise property taxes. That makes it more costly to improve property, to make it look better, to repair it, because that raises your taxes. And so there are more rundown neighborhoods, and more historical structures fade into oblivion faster because it's more costly to maintain them, because it raises your property taxes. And likewise, most states have income taxes, and so higher income taxes reduce productivity and work. Okay, so these are all effects of increased public provision, government production of schooling. And then, of course, there's tax evasion, too. Avoidance is legal, which again means not doing what it is that's being taxed or doing it less. Evasion is illegal. Nevertheless, the higher the rate of taxation, the more people are inclined, some of them are, to do things to evade paying taxes that they owe. Once we make the content of schooling political, which occurs when we decide to produce schooling through publicly owned and publicly staffed facilities, there's going to be conflict over schooling content. And I mentioned on several occasions for our course that a brief study of our State Board of Education here in Texas will tell you what I'm not sure what word to use, pathetic, ludicrous, ridiculous process this is to try to get everybody to reasonably agree on what should be taught. Many things that is just mind-boggling that it isn't included, for example, in a history textbook, is excluded, and then things that you would think are relatively trivial but turn out to be a politically correct bone to toss to some politically connected group or to cement a compromise in a diverse coalition suddenly becomes very prominent in a history book. And you wouldn't think that even math books in particular wouldn't be anything political about those. But the same thing, because they contain examples that are somehow biased or against certain groups or make some groups struggle with the mathematical concept more than others because of their background. Once you make schooling political, you also increase the potential for corruption and patronage-based spending of the money and hiring of people. And last but not least, and definitely least recognized, when you make schooling free, financed by taxes and funded and created by, delivered by governmental nonprofit entities, you take the profits and price signals out of the process of producing that product, schooling. And we've learned from experience, though it's not widely understood by the general population, that it's very, very difficult to produce anything in a high-performing, thriving way without the price signals that result from changing supply and changing demand, and the profit and loss that results from those changes in price signals. Let me just give you a quick example of how this could matter. Right now, with schooling, public schooling at least, fully funded by taxes, families have no incentive to choose cheaper versions of schooling, even though the cheaper version may work just fine for their child. So it would be helpful to signal that different kinds of pedagogy, different kinds of themes, different ways, for instance, online versus face-to-face, different kinds of schooling cost different amounts of money. Now you're saying, well, maybe that's unfair. Maybe that what works best for Johnny is the more expensive stuff, but Johnny's from a low-income family. Well, we can deal with that. We can provide subsidies and scholarships on a case-by-case basis based on the characteristics of the child. But if you have a situation where a child can do equally well with a cheaper versus more expensive way of teaching something, you certainly want to have them have an incentive to choose the cheaper version. And likewise, for entrepreneurs, if families are willing to pay more for something because it's more effective, you want that to be signaled to them in a way that they pay attention to, because prices going up signals higher profits, and so they'll jump in on that. And that doesn't mean that something that families are willing to pay for has to stay expensive, but initially the higher price is what attracts the entrepreneurs to produce the things that families are willing to pay the most to enroll their children in. And likewise, motivating educators occurs through price signals, where maybe teaching math pays more than teaching English. So then we increase the number of math teachers, maybe because there was a shortage there, and decrease the number of English teachers, maybe because there was a surplus there. So it allocates personnel among different ways of teaching in different types, disciplines, different pedagogies, face-to-face versus online. Again, is the more obvious, most obvious difference in how pedagogies could differ. All right, now we're up to slide 13, and we're in the 20th century now, the 1900s. And some of the problems with political control are just starting to surface. In particular, the patronage, the corruption, and so there was a progressive assault on this tendency for especially local control to be corrupted and to be and to suffer problems that we still see today around the country. So there was a push to get the politics out of schooling. And it's obvious one way to do that is to privatize, but that didn't happen. Instead, they said, why don't we make it really hard for people to participate in the political process, and then the only ones that will participate in it will be the schooling-related people, and that will largely put the professionals in charge, and that they concluded that that was what they wanted to do. So they didn't eliminate political control. You can't do that unless you totally privatize it. What they did was they changed the nature of it. So they moved school board elections to their own dates, okay, made it less convenient for people to vote. There was more at-large representation, which meant that some local constituencies would not be heard, which they intended by that, that whatever the political majority of an area was, that would dominate the politics of that area more than would happen through a representative local representation. And what they did by changing political participation, whether they intended to do it or not, or whether they intended the results or not, doesn't matter at some point because it happened anyway, unintended consequences. They strengthened key special interests, and among other things, they created the separate but equal schooling, and they started to consolidate school districts, and they created a single salary schedule to prevent favoritism that was one of the results of patronage-based politics. So we had a situation where the schools were insulated from competition through their public finance monopoly, and children were assigned to schools based on where they lived, and so we had sort of local monopolies on children as well as the public finance monopoly. And we had low voter turnout for these very inconvenient elections, and so they were indeed often dominated by the special interests that that have a large stake in the outcome of school district elections. And what happened was that the intended insulation of these experts from general public accountability yielded a succession of best practice education fads. By the way, I'm reading for the moment directly from slide 16. This notion of succession of best practice education fads was documented by Diane Ravitch in Left Back, and also by Tinkering Towards Utopia by Tyack and Cuban. And so what you have here is a situation where we have experts, but these experts didn't know a lot about what they were doing because nobody knew a whole lot about it. Education research is still a booming field, and so think about that. There's still a lot we don't know about how to teach and what to teach and who learns which way best. Think back 100 years ago and how much less we knew then, so it was just a matter of, oh, I think this will work. And then it suddenly became a best practice to apply to all children. And even if it was a good idea for some children, it was a disaster for many children. And so we have a situation where we had to offer something to everybody if we offered it to anybody because of the political nature of schooling. And indeed, there are a few such practices that work best for everybody, or even for the vast majority. So we had this succession of education practice fads. Things were tried and ultimately ditched because they didn't work for everybody, and failure indeed was the repeated norm, as it says on slide 17. I'm not aware, and I'm going to read slide 18 now, simply because I think this is particularly important as a matter of context. I'm not aware of any evidence that the insulation from politics proponents at the time carefully thought about how the assumed accountability of the K through 12 system officials, mostly just to their conscience and somewhat to the special interests that would dominate low voter turnout elections, would influence their behavior. They probably hoped that these experts would always do the right thing and always want to do the right thing, but whether these were noble individuals or crafty political insiders or some mixture of the above, what we have, and what we still have, because we haven't fundamentally changed the system that they created, is nation at risk outcomes. As it says on slide 19, I really don't want to get into all of what those fads are. You can read about them in the books that I've assigned, and of the two, Tyack and Cuban is the shorter one. So you might want to go to that. It's one of those marginal benefit, marginal cost issues that we economists confront all of the time. The time cost of going through these individual fads and how they arose and how they were implemented and how and when they were ditched for the next fad is just something we are not going to allocate the time to do unless you want to raise the issues in our online discussion, and then we'll get into them to the extent that the thread that someone starts leads to more interesting discussion. We're on slide 20 now out of 21, so we're just about done. What happened as a result of these reforms is we increased political control of schooling by more levels of schooling. We put more people in charge of more things. We have a state board of education, we have local school districts, we have the state legislature, we have the federal Department of Education. Disappointment with local political accountability led to increased state control. And disappointment with the politics, are you getting the common denominator here? Politics. They didn't grasp that, or the politics, meaning use of force, I mean that's what politics is. The political control folks didn't want to give up their political control, even if they recognized that was the problem. And so we had increased state control when there was problem with local control, but we still have local control. Now we have state control along with it. So again, the fragmentation. And disappointment with state control at that level has been leading to increased federal intervention. And now in our last slide for Learning Module 4, we have come full circle with the latest political fix, the parent trigger legislation, as it's called. It's still political. It means that a majority of school stakeholders, sometimes just the parents, sometimes the parents with the teachers, depending on which state, several states have now enacted parent trigger legislation, they have to agree, politics, a majority of them have to form some sort of a coalition and compromise and all that political deal making on exactly what it is that they want as a replacement, a transformation of some kind of their local school. For example, the parent trigger law may allow for a transformation of the neighborhood public school, traditional public school, into a charter school. But the charter school will have basically the same challenges and problems, namely the need to serve every child assigned to it based on the fact that it lives closest to that school and hasn't been assigned to any other school. It will still have all the same basic problems, and so as you can tell, I do not have high hopes for parent trigger legislation as a way to fundamentally change schooling. Nevertheless, I support it. As it says there in the title of that blog on that you can click on slide 21, it's a bad idea whose time has come, simply because the alternative of not allowing parents to transform a school, which may be disastrously ineffective, that option of denying parents that right is even worse. Well, thank you. We'll see you in class in a few days, and we'll have an exam on October 7th. And for those who might view this presentation in a different year than I recorded, that would be October 7, 2014, when that exam will include learning modules 1 through 4.